Good morning. Welcome back to our Biomechanics of the Golf Swing. My name is Vance Freno, again, exercise physiologist, golf performance specialist. We're going to take you through the shoulder today. We're going to take a look at the role of the shoulder in general function and then how it applies to the golf swing. And we'll discuss a couple of ideas on how we use certain implements to help the soft tissue to mobilize that a little bit better and then strengthening. So just a real quick review. We did weeks 1 was the feet. We talked about how the feet integrate to the ground, how they give us that nice strong foundation to be able to lock us in through the loading of the feet, loads up in the hips and the pelvis. Week 2, we covered that. We took a look at how that pelvis has to be able to rotate and how those hip joints have to go through all their motion. And it gets all those big butt muscles, all these big hip muscles to be able to load, to be able to start driving power. In week 3, we talked about how all of this power that was being loaded up had to get rotated, get sent through the spine to get to the arms and eventually to a golf club, or if I'm throwing something a ball. So we have the spine as a torque converter. So I have all that building up, and that spine's got to be able to load in the 3 planes of motion we discussed at the different levels. And then from there, I can create that whip and be able to get the golf club to move. So all that now, as we built up, is I've gotten everything through here. We talked it now. The shoulders have to have the ability to help get the arms in position so that the arms can come and eventually release the golf club. So just a real brief overview of the shoulders. I'm going to tip my screen just a pinch. So the shoulders should be able to go through what we call as flexion, just up. Now when we're going to be assessing, we're going to relook to where the arms can get relative to the head and the ear without the person leaning back. We also know that the shoulder should be able to extend. It should be able to abduct. It should be able to, abduct and then adduct. It also should be able to create what is called horizontal adduction and then horizontal abduction. And then we know it has to have the ability to internally rotate and then externally rotate. Okay, so those are the primary motions. And then when we talk about how we assess it and strengthen it, we'll go back and look at some of those motions. What's a real important issue in regard to shoulder when people are coming in when we're assessing is going to be the role of the shoulder blade. So I'm going to have Vanessa step in here. And so we're not doing our social distance. She has her mask on. And what we're going to do is have her face away from the camera. And so just take your right arm and just lift over your head. So we're just going to do it about 5 times. So every time that she lifts that arm up, this shoulder blade is moving. You can watch my fingertip will follow it. So we call this an upper rotation of the scapula. So the shoulder has to do this. Now take your hand like you're throwing a frisbee. And just like that. So she's reach across your body just a little bit more. There you go. And then come all the way across. As she's doing that, notice the shoulder blade, again, gliding along the rib cage. Now hers moves really well. So what we find is that the success of the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder joint is very dependent on what's happening at the scapulothoracic joint. If this does not have its ability to get into those patterns, she'll have dysfunction there. So for an example, I'm going to try to hold her shoulder blade in place here a little bit. And now if she lifts her arm up, try to lift up, I'm going to restrict her. I'm going to block her. So when people are coming in and they're having some shoulder pain, and we'll talk about some of what those can be, oftentimes we need to take a look at what's happening here that's affecting here. So the impingement and the pain is up here, but we know the dysfunction might be coming. Similarly, we're going to look at the mid-back. Now we talked about the thoracic spine in part 3 on this. So I'm going to get Vanessa to go, actually let's just go both hands, even without the golf stance, just both hands straight above your head. As she brings her straight above her head, her thoracic spine goes into extension. She's actually extending back. Now go into your golf stance. Now we're going to turn this into golf. Good, now bring your arms up and down about 5 times. So every time she's going through shoulder flexion, we want to know, is this thoracic spine actually going to, is it moving as it should? Now hold your hands over your head and do the side to side for me. Just like that. Now within that position, can the thoracic spine laterally bend? And then just dangle your arms and just do the rotation. And just rotate them side to side.
My arms?
Yep, just like a golf swing.
Oh, like this?
Yep, and then rotate. Good, and let the shoulders turn. Good, let them really pendulum both ways. There you go. Perfect, that's perfect. So again, now we're looking can it rotate? So we want to know what's happening here to understand. You can recover and stand up, and then to understand what's happening here, and then that will bring us in to what is actually happening at the shoulder joint. So even if somebody comes in, they don't have any pain in their shoulder, but we notice that they can't get their arms overhead. We're going to look, is the shoulder blade doing its job? If it is, we know the restriction may be up here. It could be a combination of both things. So as we start assessing that, we're going to break that down and find out, is there dysfunction? If that person can't get their arm in position, what is driving that dysfunction? Okay, the other thing, I'm going to have you turn your face out that way, is what we call internal-external rotation. So I'm going to have you bring your arm up to 90 degrees here. Now I want you to take your arm and just turn it back. So now if you notice with Vanessa, she could do it pretty easily. So we're looking at her body angle to this. This is greater. She's got pretty good external rotation. Now from the same thing, let me just turn down. And we're looking for internal rotation. The external is what we're mostly focusing on, but we'll also look at internal. Good, and recover. Now these are, we say, is in isolation. And isolation means everything else, nothing else is moving in that. But when we start getting into total global assessment, isolation versus integration, or we say integrated function, now what we would do is, I'm just going to have you do a simple step forward and reach your arms over your head. Good, so good, just repeat that same thing. So now again, so I'm watching with Vanessa do that. Can she get her arms into flexion as her whole body goes into extension? Good, and on the last one, let your eyes follow your hands. Good, and that helps, the head goes back, it helps show that. So we'll look at isolation, we'll see what's happening there, but then we always got to turn that back into function. Thank you, appreciate it. So the assessment piece is important. So we understand what the shoulder should be doing. We need to understand how well it can do it isolated to some degree, but really integrated in function. To finish some of the testing we did with Vanessa, if you recall from when we were talking about the hips, and we would take the patterns of moving the hips around in these different positions, we're also looking at the shoulder. We're looking, can the shoulders have this, what we call this abduction adduction? Can they rotate with the body, and are those shoulder blades working with the spine, with the pelvis, all the way down to the feet? So again, when we look at that, we're going to try to figure out, is there lack of motion? If that motion is being hindered, what's hindering it? Is it just a real adhesive capsule type of thing? That person's capsule just glued down? Or is the shoulder blade not working? Is the thoracic spine not working? And usually with most, especially in our demographic, we're probably finding combinations of all the above. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the golf swing. We'll take this into the golf swing. I want to get back a little bit more to the rehab and how we integrate versus isolate. In the golf swing, the arms have got to have enough ability. Obviously, if I make a good turn, this is what we call that, this horizontal adduction of this arm across my body. This is actually externally rotating to get to that platter position. And then from my position here, now we know in most golf teachers, I would think this elbow should be in this position here. We don't want this chicken winged out. If the club is coming up to some degree, we want to know why. The why might just be you're just doing it. You're just not controlling it. The other why might be because when we test a person external rotation, they go and they're blocked here. I mean, that's their external rotation. So it'll be virtually impossible to get down in that position. On the downswing, it says equally important. So on my downswing, if my pelvis does the job and I start getting into this position and I'm driving through, note where this helps to get this here. If I'm stuck here, it's very hard to get my club face on the proper path to make my impact. So again, so we will relate what we're seeing in function, we'll break it down into some golf specifics and see how well that can integrate into your golf swing. Okay, so when we go to talk about this whole isolation integration, there's something they call sticky statements. And a sticky statement is just some sort of a, like we were talking core, and how some guy I learned from said, if your body ain't moving, your core ain't grooving. And we talked about that last week, that the hips and pelvis should be moving, and that's what turns the core on. Strength conditioning coach, one time we were going through similar, and he just said, listen, simple way to think about it, get hip to the shoulder. It's corny, but it works, meaning my shoulders shouldn't really be doing anything that my hips have not told it to do. Now, of course, if I took this ball and wanted to put it up on a cabinet, that's not a problem. But now if this ball weighed 50 pounds, I want to integrate motion. If I'm going to throw, I'm trying to integrate my hips to be able to set the load through this whole core. Everything loads and works together, no matter what the pattern that we're trying to do that has an explosiveness. If there's a push, a press, a pull, anything, the hips integrate in, it turns everything on, and now those shoulders are much more successful. In an EMG study I had read quite a while back, they actually had people and they harnessed their arms so they couldn't use their arms. They're kind of locked in, and they just had them doing these different things with the hips. And by just doing these with whatever with the hips, engaging the hips, the EMGs around the shoulder blades were turning on. So the body intuitively know, oh, he just loaded his hips. It's probably to use his arm to do something, to push something, to pull something. That's how we're wired. That's how we're built. So what happens is a lot of times in therapy or in just general strength training, we get into this whole isolation stuff. You will see people with rotator cuff issues. Now let me just touch on the rotator cuff. So the rotator cuff is a series of 4 muscles. They come in, they converge. One comes from here, several come from underneath, and so forth. As they converge in, they form a tendon, and that rotator cuff tendon oftentimes gets injured. Now, again, the injuries can be brought on from the dysfunctions we were talking about. We can get where this bone migrates up and pops and bangs into what is called urochromia, that bone, if you feel it right there. With the shoulder blade timing, so on this impingement, which is really common, I see a lot of it, is what happens is when I go to lift my arm up, whatever position, my shoulder blade rides up like we just saw in Vanessa, and 2 of the rotator cuff muscles grab that humeral head and they pull it down and they get it and it clears. So now that, I have a socket, it pulled, I have a nice clearance. Well, problem is if my shoulder blade doesn't do its job, again, like I was showing on Vanessa, and I'm going to lift, and the shoulder blade can't get its rhythm and its timing to find its position, this humeral bone bangs into this acromion. Bang, bang, bang. And all eventually the structures underneath become frayed, bursitis, tendonitis, and so forth. Other aspect of that is what the rotator cuff actually does in function. In isolation, it externally rotates. So oftentimes you'll see for rehab, somebody's taking the band or the dumbbell or whatever, and they're strengthening external rotation. And even though it does that in isolation, in function, it does completely the opposite. It decelerates internal rotation. So when I go to do something like throw a ball and my arm is going to externally rotate, those external rotators are not doing that. That's momentum. As I step into this position, my body's moving forward. This is externally rotating because of the momentum of where my body's going. Now, as I unload this and my arm swings in, imagine those rotator cuff muscles are like horse's reins holding onto that bone. As this comes across my body, and you could think, and any of those types of anything we're working on, whether it's golf throwing, like that, like horse's reins, they're trying to slow that bone down. They're reeling that bone in. They're pulling that back. So if all I do is strengthen it to concentrically contract and create external rotation, I've done nothing to prepare it to decelerate internal rotation. So again, the strengthening pieces that we look at and the conditioning and even the rehab when that's necessary needs to take that into effect. So that's, again, integration versus isolation. So when we look at anything mechanically in regard to your whole body with this golf swing and with anything, we want to know how are the feet working with the hands and how is it moving up through that whole kinetic chain, and try to find the weak link in that chain. So if somebody comes in with a shoulder injury and I'm trying to figure that out, I have to go all the way down to their ankle and so forth. And I mentioned this, I think, in the preview video. Chicago White Sox pitcher, elbow injury, needed Tommy John surgery, rehab, was doing okay, started throwing, started coming all back. In the end, they were able to connect what was causing this was his big toe. His big toe didn't have the ability to go through the motion that it had, and it literally, because it was putting him out of position as he was trying to throw, because his body couldn't get over the foot properly, it was actually creating elbow issues. So this integrated chain matters. So we look at the shoulder, if there's dysfunction, if there's pain, if there's issues, if there's limitations, what is driving it? Now, I will say that if something else caused this not to function well, then eventually this starts gluing, and also now I have a shoulder that the capsule won't move very well, but that was started because something else wasn't functioning well. So we get hip to the shoulders to get everything to work together. Okay, so the treatment and strengthening. So treatment, again, it would depend. If somebody comes in and they have great function throughout those patterns, I don't need to do a ton of soft tissue. I have good motion. I do a little bit of soft tissue work, but it's mostly going to be integrated movement patterns to strengthen and all these different patterns that we just talked about, how I integrate my body to get that shoulder. And if I have restrictions, if I have somebody comes in, they have restriction, they have pain, then we're going to step back and say, okay, how do we clear the path? You know, I have a golfer comes in, man, every time I do that, it just bites me right across the front of the shoulder. We've seen that a lot. Well, again, he's impinging. This bone's sliding, it's slamming into this, and it's pinching off, whether it's the long head of the bicep and so forth, maybe vice versa. And so we need to clear that. So there are a variety of techniques. Now, we talked in the previous video, somebody said, hey, give us some take-home exercises. Hard to do because I don't know what's bothering you, but let me just give you, again, just a general broad one. Hangs, dead hang. So a dead hang, I get on a bar, and I should be able to support my whole body weight and just hang. If you don't have the hand strength for that, we're going to address that next week and why hand strength matters, not just for golf, but for life. But just dead hanging and allowing your body to breathe, and you're allowing that capsule to decompress. And we've been doing this as far as back in my career as I can remember, getting people to dead hang because it worked. Never really saw research on it until recently. There was a research article that showed dead hanging, and their goal was to get you to 60 seconds. So most people had started out with 10 seconds, increments and built up. And when that was combined and they had a few other exercises, it was like 92+% of the people who went through that protocol got better. How much of this mattered, I don't know. I like to have seen it with that and without to see what the thing. But I know experiential, and for me, I've had some pretty significant bike crashes and have torn up both of my shoulders. Actually, this shoulder, because my collarbone and my ribs are dislocated here, this shoulder tends to sit, the shoulder blades just dipped in. These are not structurally where they're supposed to be. So I've had a tendency to have some issues. When I get back and when I'm consistent with my dead hanging and some of the soft tissue, I never have any issues with it. I get away from it, and all of a sudden they'll start creeping back. Now, with that said, if you go to dead hang and you're like, wow, that's causing me pain, it's not a good exercise for you. So it's hard to say, hey, do a dead hang, it's going to clear your shoulder. It might, but we don't know until we see what's causing your pain and what kind of dysfunction that you have. Now, as far as some of the tools we use, foam rolling. We talked about, I think last week on the thoracic roller, we have a video that talks about thoracic extension using the roller. It's a separate video, not part of our golf series, but part of the stretching series. We can use this to roll up into this axilla area, down into the muscles of the ribs to try to open all this up. We use other type of devices. This ball has some grooves in it, and we can also use this. Again, it gets into that connective tissue, that fascia, to release it. The role of the shoulder blade and of the ribs. Lacrosse ball, putting the cross ball in certain particular spots and taking the arm through motion. It pins the tissue up against the rib cage. It actually mobilizes the ribs. So I can mobilize the ribs as my arm is trying to get my shoulder blade to move, and it opens all that connective tissue. And then this is what we call a voodoo floss. And again, just a couple devices. We can wrap somebody, get them to create motion, and it helps open up. So once we have the pathways cleared and we start integrating the strength into that, and again, the strength pattern could be any of hundreds of things relative to what we're seeing with that dysfunction. Again, just a couple simple things: shoulder blade retraction, grabbing bands, grabbing cables, making sure that those shoulder blade muscles can do their job, doing it from a high position down and so forth. And like I mentioned, anytime we're going to use any of these types of motions, we're going to try to use our hips in which to do that and integrate some of those general functions in. So that's it for today. Again, shoulder function, how it integrates in, the role of the shoulder blade and how the spine and how all that works together to make this successful. If there's a dysfunction, we need to figure out why. If there's not a dysfunction, there's limitation, we need to clear those paths. And then once those paths are clear, we can get really aggressive with our strengthening. Are there any questions out there? I think last week I kind of jumped to exit, but if there's anybody on who has a question, please, you can pop it up there now. And if not, we will see you next week. Next week, actually, let me quick, wrist and hands next week. Why that motion matters, but why grip strength matters, and it's a critical aspect of just human life, of performance in general. I don't see any questions popping up, so I want to thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next week.